My son blocked me at the resort gate, sneering that I would ruin his big day. He had no clue that the 60-year-old woman he was turning away held the legal power to freeze every asset he claimed to own. I checked my phone. It was 12 o'clock sharp. As I turned to leave, I did not cry. I simply activated the freeze order that would turn his 6-figure wedding into a very public bankruptcy. My name is Eleanor Ellie Price, and at 61 years old, I have learned that the hottest fires are often the ones that burn in silence. I stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Silver Palms estate, the Florida sun beating down on my shoulders, while a security guard who looked young enough to be my grandson scanned a clipboard with a frown. The humidity made my simple navy dress cling uncomfortably to my back, but I refused to fidget. Inside the gates, I could see the manicured lawns and the white silk ribbons fluttering in the breeze, preparing for the wedding of the season. The guard finally looked up, his face a mask of professional apology. He told me that my name was not on the list. I told him to check again, my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then I saw him. Lucas Price, my 35-year-old son, strode down the long driveway. He looked like a stranger in his bespoke tuxedo, the fabric shimmering in the heat. He did not look like the boy I had raised on coupons and late-night sewing shifts. He looked like a man who owned the world, or at least thought he did. He stopped 5 feet away from the gate, refusing to open it. "Mom, I told you," Lucas said, his voice low and laced with a cold, terrifying irritation. "If you try to come, you'll ruin the day. Go home." I froze. The words slapped me harder than the physical heat. For a second, the mother in me wanted to weep, to reach through the bars and ask him why he was doing this. But then, a strange, icy calm washed over me. It was the clarity of a woman who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because she dug the graves. He thought I was here to beg. He had no idea I was here to deliver a verdict. From behind the hedge, Sabrina Lowell appeared. She looked perfect in her silk robe, her hair already done up in intricate waves. She feigned a look of concern, bringing a hand to her mouth, but her eyes told a different story. There was relief there, pure, unadulterated relief that the embarrassment was being handled. Behind her, I could see members of the Lowell family, her wealthy relatives, whispering among themselves. They were too far away for me to hear the exact words, but I knew the script. They were talking about the mother from the Rust Belt, the one who might have a glass of wine and tell the truth about where the money came from. They needed me gone before the live stream cameras started rolling. I looked past them. I looked at the imported white roses, the massive air-conditioned tent, the orchestra setting up their instruments. It was a scene of absolute opulence. It was also a scene entirely funded by accounts that bore my signature as a guarantor. Every petal, every glass of champagne, every brick of the house, Lucas had just bought it all, rested on a financial foundation that I had built. And more importantly, one that I could dismantle. The security guard stepped forward again, his hand resting on his belt. He asked me to step away from the private property. I did not argue. I simply smiled, a small, sad curvature of my lips that Lucas frowned at. I pulled my phone from my purse and checked the time. It was exactly 12 o'clock in the afternoon. The specific clauses in the contracts I had reviewed with my lawyer were triggered at noon on this very date. "Goodbye, Lucas," I said softly. I turned my back on the gates. As I walked toward the guest parking lot where my 10-year-old sedan sat baking in the sun, I heard Sabrina's voice carry on the wind. She leaned in to kiss Lucas on the cheek. "See, you chose right. She's gone," she whispered. I reached my car and unlocked the door. The interior was stiflingly hot, smelling of old upholstery and the vanilla air freshener I bought in bulk. I sat in the driver's seat and placed my phone on the dashboard. The screen lit up with a notification that I had been waiting for. Freeze order. Confirmed Price Innovations and Lowell Holdings accounts suspended. I stared at the screen. They thought they had banned a nuisance. They never imagined they had just locked themselves out of their own lives, driving away from the resort. The pristine palm trees of Florida seemed to blur into the grey, smokestack skyline of Ridgeport, Ohio. That was where my life had truly begun and, in some ways, where it had ended. For 30 years, I sat behind a metal desk at Harborline Assurance, processing claims, denying appeals, and reading the fine print that most people ignored until it was too late. I was good at it. I learned early on that the world is built on paper, and whoever understands the paperwork controls the outcome. But back then, I did not use that knowledge for power. I used it to survive. After my husband died in a factory accident, Ridgeport felt colder. The settlement money was not a fortune, but it was enough to buy a sports car or a long vacation if I had been that kind of woman. Instead, I locked it away. I worked my shift at Harborline from 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, and then I would drive to the local diner or the hardware store to do their bookkeeping until midnight. I lived on coffee and the desperate fear that Lucas would feel the absence of a father or the sting of poverty. I remember nights when I sat at the kitchen table, stitching the knees of his jeans because we could not afford new ones. I would skip my blood pressure medication for a week just to save the $200 needed for his football camp. I never told him. A mother's love is often silent, hidden in the things she goes without. Lucas was a brilliant boy. He had eyes that burned with a hunger I never possessed. I remember him sitting on the floor, surrounded by textbooks, looking up at me with absolute seriousness. "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to make $1 million. He would promise, his voice trembling with determination. "You won't have to work 2 jobs. I'll buy you a big house." "I don't need a big house." "Lucas," I would tell him, smoothing his hair, "I just need you to be a good man." But the definition of a good man began to change when he left for college in Harbor City. It was the first time he stepped out of our blue-collar world and into a place where people judged you by the cut of your suit rather than the calluses on your hands. I remember visiting him during his sophomore year. I wore my best coat, a wool blend I had bought on sale at Sears 5 years prior. When I walked into his dorm room, his roommates were laughing about something. Lucas saw me, and for a split second, I saw shame in his eyes. He hurried me out of the room before I could say more than a hello. We went to a cheap diner near campus. I tried to ask about his classes, but he kept looking around, as if terrified someone would hear my flat Ohio vowel sounds. "Mum, please," he hissed when I laughed a little too loudly at a joke. "People here, they're different. You don't have to act so." Ridgeport. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I wanted to tell him that Ridgeport paid for his tuition. I wanted to tell him that my Ridgeport hands were tired from typing claims forms so he could study philosophy and computer science. But I didn't. I just nodded and drank my water. When his father's settlement check finally cleared the long legal process, I sat up late one night in our small kitchen. The only sound was the humming of the refrigerator. I counted the figures on the bank statement. It was $40,000. To me, it was a fortune. It was my safety net. But as I looked at the numbers, I did not see a retirement fund. I saw a cushion for Lucas. I saw the seed money for a dream he hadn't even fully formed yet. I filed the paperwork away with the same meticulous care I used at the insurance office, believing I was securing his future. I had no idea that I was essentially drafting the first weapon for a war I didn't know I would have to fight. I thought I was building a foundation for my son to stand on, never suspecting he would use it to build a wall to keep me out. Lucas did not stay in Ohio. The ink was barely dry on his diploma when he packed his bags for Bayfield, Florida, a coastal city that smelled of salt spray and old money. He joined a startup, then quit 6 months later to found Price Innovations. At first, his empire was nothing more than a sublet apartment and 3 servers humming in a closet. But Lucas had the kind of ambition that could burn down a forest. One Tuesday night, he called me. His voice was different, tight, with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "Mom, I need you to trust me," he said, the static of the phone line unable to mask his intensity. "I have the code. I have the platform. I just need the capital to launch before someone else does. If I pull this off, I can pay you back 10 times over. I promise." He needed $75,000. It was everything I had. It was the insurance settlement from his father's death, the emergency fund I had scraped together from decades of denying myself vacations and new clothes, and the equity in the house. I did not hesitate, though perhaps I should have. I went to the pawn shop in Ridgeport and sold my diamond wedding ring. I went to the bank and took out a second mortgage on the house I had finally paid off. When the papers arrived for me to sign, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee. I read every line. I saw the terms of the investment, the structure of the shares, and the clauses about silent partners. I knew, legally speaking, that I was leaving myself exposed. But this was Lucas. This was the boy whose knees I had patched. I signed my name, Eleanor Price, and sent my life's work to Florida. Success did not trickle in. It exploded. 18 months later, a major national bank licensed the financial algorithm Lucas had built. Overnight, my son went from a college graduate with credit card debt to a face on the cover of tech magazines. He moved out of the sublet and into a penthouse overlooking the marina. He bought a German sports car that cost more than my entire house. Suddenly, his stories were populated with names I only knew from the society pages: Lowell, Carrington, Devereaux. My life in Ridgeport remained exactly the same, except for the silence. The phone calls became shorter, more transactional. "Mum, I can't talk long. I'm stepping into a meeting," he would say, his voice brisk. "I just wanted to tell you I finished paying off the car repair." I would say, "That's great. Look, Mum, maybe don't mention the extra sewing work to anyone if reporters call. We're crafting a specific narrative here. You know, self-made, visionary. The struggling single mom angle is a bit overplayed." I swallowed the hurt and told myself he was just stressed. I told myself this was the price of greatness. Then came Thanksgiving. Lucas brought Sabrina Lowell home for the first time. She was a lawyer, the daughter of a real estate tycoon, and she walked into my small, siding-clad house as if she were entering a museum exhibit on poverty. She was polite, painfully so. She complimented the quaint porcelain figurines on my mantelpiece and ate my turkey with small, measured bites. It must be so hard to maintain a place like this. All by yourself, Sabrina said, her eyes scanning the worn carpet in the living room. I felt a prick of shame, hot and sudden. I looked at Lucas, waiting for him to say that this house was filled with love, that it had built him. Instead, he checked his watch. We should probably hit the road before the snow starts. He said. The real blow came 2 months later, during a visit I made to Bayfield. Lucas threw a small cocktail party for his inner circle. I stood in the corner, holding a glass of champagne I was afraid to drink, wearing a dress from a department store that suddenly felt like a costume. Sabrina was holding court with a group of friends, her hand resting possessively on Lucas's arm. Ellie is just darling, I heard her say, her voice carrying over the low jazz music. She wanted to cook dinner for us last night instead of going to the bistro. She is just so traditional, like something out of a black and white movie. The group laughed. It was a soft, tinkling sound, like ice hitting glass. I looked at Lucas. I waited for him to correct her, to say that his mother was not a relic, but the reason he was standing in that room. Lucas looked at me, then looked back at Sabrina. He smiled. Yeah, she's definitely old school, he said. He took a sip of his drink and turned his back to me to greet a man in a velvet blazer. In that moment, surrounded by the ocean view and the smell of expensive perfume, I realized that my son had not just moved away. He had ascended, and he had decided that I was too heavy to carry with him. The engagement party was held at Azure, a rooftop restaurant in Bayfield, where a glass of tap water seemed to cost more than my hourly wage back in 1995. Lucas flew me down for the event, a gesture that felt generous until I saw my itinerary. While the entire Lowell clan was booked into suites at the 5-star St. Regis Resort, I was checked into the Sand Dollar Motel, a roadside establishment 3 miles inland where the neon sign buzzed loudly enough to keep me awake at night. When I asked Lucas about it, he didn't even look up from his phone. It's peak season. Mum, everywhere else was booked. Besides, you don't need all that fancy room service stuff. Right, I accepted it. I always accepted it. But the humiliation was just beginning. At the party, surrounded by women in silk and men in Italian linen, I felt like a stain on a pristine tablecloth. The Lowells dominated the conversation, raising toast after toast to family tradition and legacy, speaking as if Price Innovations had been born from their connections rather than my second mortgage. I tried to make conversation with Victoria Lowell, Sabrina's mother. She was a woman who looked like she had been frozen at age 40 for the last 2 decades. I complimented her on the flower arrangements. She looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her hand resting on a diamond necklace that probably cost as much as my house. Thank you. Eleanor, she said, her voice smooth and cold. We wanted everything to be perfect. You must be so proud that Lucas has stepped into a world so different from where he started. It really is a miracle he overcame his circumstances. I wanted to tell her that his circumstances were a loving home and a mother who bled herself dry for him. Instead, I just nodded. Then came the photographs. The photographer, a man hired by the Lowells, spent 20 minutes arranging the group. He placed Lucas and Sabrina in the center, flanked by Victoria and her husband. When it was my turn, he paused, looking through his lens with a frown. Mrs. Price, could you... Maybe take a half step to the left, a little more. Back. Yes. Right there. The lighting is better. By the time he snapped the picture, I was barely in the frame, my shoulder half obscured by a decorative palm plant. I looked around, hoping Lucas would say something, hoping he would pull me into the center. He didn't. He was too busy laughing at something Sabrina's father had whispered. The real war, however, began over the guest list. The next morning, over a brunch I was barely invited to. Sabrina laid out a spreadsheet. "We need to keep the ceremony intimate," she said, her pen hovering over the list of names from Ridgeport. "I think we should cut your cousins from Ohio, and the neighbors you put down. It just feels a bit crowded. We want a sophisticated vibe. You know I can pay for their flights," I offered quickly, desperate to have someone from my side of the aisle. "I have some savings left. It won't cost you a dime." Sabrina smiled. That same pitying, terrifying smile. "Oh, Eleanor, it's not about the money. The Lowells have the finances completely covered. It's about the aesthetic. We don't want people feeling uncomfortable because they don't know which fork to use." I looked at Lucas. He was staring at his plate, cutting his eggs with surgical precision. "Lucas," I asked. "She's right." "Mum?" He mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "We don't want it to be awkward." The final blow landed that evening. I was staying at the penthouse to help organize some gifts while they went out for drinks. They came back earlier than expected, and I was in the kitchen, out of sight. I heard Sabrina's voice in the hallway, loud and uninhibited by wine. She was on the phone. "No, I know," she was saying, laughing. "He's great, but the baggage is heavy. If he cuts the anchor with the past, he'll really be one of us. But right now, it's just so exhausting pretending to care about her little insurance stories." I stood frozen next to the refrigerator. When Lucas walked in a moment later and saw me, he didn't apologize. He just looked annoyed that I was still there. Later, when I mentioned I was telling a story about Ridgeport to one of his investors earlier, he snapped. "Mum, please, don't mention Ridgeport to these people. It sounds so blue-collar. Just say you're retired. It's better for the brand." I sat alone in the living room after they went to bed. I looked at the new photos they had already hung on the wall. In the large, glossy print of the engagement party, the Lowell family was beaming in sharp focus. And there, on the far right edge, was a blurry sliver of a navy dress. I was already being cropped out of the picture. I just hadn't realized until now that my son was the one holding the scissors. 2 weeks before the wedding, the tears stopped. They were replaced by the cold, rhythmic ticking of a clock that I had heard for 30 years at Harborline Assurance. It started with a notification on my phone, a generic email from a bank I did not bank with, regarding an update to guarantor profile for a credit line attached to Price Innovations and a new entity called Lowell Price Developments. I sat at the small desk in my motel room, putting on my reading glasses. Most mothers would have hit delete or forwarded it to their son without a second thought. But I was not just a mother. I was a claims adjuster who had spent decades finding the lies hidden in plain sight. I opened the attachment. My eyes scanned the legalese, skipping the fluff and landing on the liability clauses. There, in black and white, was my name listed as the primary guarantor for a commercial loan of $3 million. My blood ran cold. The collateral listed was not the penthouse or the new office building. It was all personal real estate and retirement holdings of the guarantor. My house in Ridgeport, my 401k. If this new development project failed, I would be homeless and destitute, while the Lowells, hiding behind limited liability corporations, would walk away clean. I called Lucas immediately. It's just a technicality. Mom, Lucas said, his voice sounding tinny and distant through the car speakerphone. The bank just likes your credit history. It's about stability metrics. I'll have the lawyers take your name off as soon as the merger deal closes next month. Stop worrying. Lucas, this puts my house at risk. I need to see the full contract, I said, gripping the phone. I'm driving into a tunnel. I'll send it later, he said, and the line went dead. He never sent it. 2 nights later, I was at his penthouse, waiting for the movers to bring in some boxes. On the dining table, buried under a stack of wedding invitations, I saw a thick binder. I opened it. It was the full loan agreement. I turned to the signature page. There was my name, Eleanor Price, signed in blue ink. I ran my thumb over it. The paper was smooth. There was no indentation. It was a high-resolution color copy of a signature I had provided for a car lease 3 years ago, lifted and placed here without my consent. Next to the contract was a budget spreadsheet printed on landscape paper. It detailed the wedding costs, the down payment for a yacht, and the renovation of a new estate. I ran my finger down the source of funds column. Next to the Lowell's contributions, it read L.P. Senior Investment and Lowell Trust Loan. Next to my name, it simply read E. Price Guarantee. I was not a partner. I was the collateral damage. The next morning, I did not go to the bridal brunch. I took a taxi to a quiet law firm in downtown Bayfield. I paid the consultation fee in cash. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Higgins, spent an hour reviewing the photos I had taken of the documents. When she looked up, her expression was grave. Mrs. Price, you aren't just a guarantor, she said, tapping the desk. Technically, you are the largest founding shareholder of Price Innovations based on your initial capital injection. But look here. In these Series B and C funding rounds, they have issued millions of new shares to shell companies owned by the Lowell family. They are diluting you. They are turning your 40% ownership into 0.4%, while keeping your liability at 100%. So, if the company goes under, I pay the debts, I said, my voice steady. But if it succeeds, then the Lowells get the profits, and you get a thank you card. Mrs. Higgins replied, they have insulated themselves completely. You are the only person with actual skin in the game. I walked out of the office feeling a strange numbness. I went to the country club where the rehearsal dinner was being set up. I needed to use the restroom. And as I passed the open door of the VIP lounge, I heard Victoria Lowell's voice. It's brilliant, really. She was saying to a friend, the clink of ice against glass punctuating her words. The wedding is the perfect distraction. Once the merger is official and the assets are transferred to the holding company, we won't need that heavy lifting from the old lady in Ohio anymore. Lucas knows what needs to be done. I stood in the hallway. I did not storm in. I did not scream. For the first time in months, my hands stopped shaking. The hurt was gone, burned away by the white-hot realization that this was not a family dispute. This was a heist. I returned to my motel room. I sat down at my laptop and opened a new file. I did not cry. I did not look at the picture of baby Lucas I kept in my wallet. Instead, I began to type, listing every date, every transfer, and every unauthorized signature. I named the folder with a calm, deliberate keystroke. For when they forget who paid first, I was done being the mother. It was time to be the creditor. 1 week before the ceremony, the digital seating chart arrived in my inbox. I clicked the link, expecting to see my name at table 1, right next to the stage, perhaps beside an aunt or a close family friend. Instead, I had to scroll. I scrolled past the bridal party, past the Lowell family, past the investors, and finally found Eleanor Price assigned to table 19. It was a small, two-top table squeezed into the back corner, directly next to the catering service doors and the restrooms. I called Sabrina immediately. Her voice was smooth, practiced, and dripping with a poison disguised as concern. "Oh, Eleanor, I was hoping you wouldn't take it the wrong way." She purred. "We had to make some hard choices for the live stream. The production team said the lighting at the front is very harsh, and we know how how you get uncomfortable with your image. We didn't want the camera to pan to someone who looked lacking in confidence. She meant old. She meant poor. She meant that my face, with its lines of worry and hard work, did not fit the glossy aesthetic of their billion-dollar merger masquerading as a marriage." That evening, my phone buzzed with a FaceTime request from Lucas. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy. He had been drinking wine, expensive wine, likely paid for by the credit line I had unknowingly guaranteed. "Mom, we need to talk about the speeches," he said, slurring slightly. "I think it's best if you don't speak. I don't want you to get up there and start crying or, telling those depressed stories about how we used to eat canned soup. It's a celebration, Mom, not a pity party. I wasn't going to tell pity stories." "Lucas," I said, my voice trembling. I was going to say how proud I was of you. I just wanted to sit next to my son. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if I were a lingering headache he couldn't shake. "God, you're always so dramatic. Look, if you're going to be this difficult, if you're going to mope around and make everyone uncomfortable, maybe you shouldn't come." The line went dead before I could respond. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. The next morning, the official confirmation came. A junior wedding planner called me, her voice brisk and professional, to inform me that the guest list had been locked for security purposes and no further changes could be made to the seating chart. When I drove to the Silver Palms estate later that day to drop off a custom-made suit bag for Lucas, a final, foolish act of motherly love, the head of security stopped me at the perimeter. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Price," he said, looking down at a tablet. "The groom and bride have updated the access protocols. You aren't on the clearance list for the main ceremony tomorrow, unless you're entering with the catering staff. I can't let you in." I stood there, clutching the suit bag, feeling the heat rise up my neck. I wanted to throw the bag at him. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. But then, a familiar sensation washed over me. It was the cold, analytical detachment I used to feel when I spotted a fraudulent insurance claim. In my line of work, the person who screams is the person who loses. The person who wins is the one who has the paperwork. I drove back to my motel room. I did not sleep. I stripped the cheap floral bedspread off the mattress and laid out every single document I had gathered. The fraudulent loan agreement, the scanned signatures, the emails from the bank. The original partnership deed from the founding of Price Innovations. I picked up the phone and dialed Mrs. Higgins's personal number. It was 11 o'clock at night. "Start the filing," I said. "I want the freeze order ready to drop the second the courthouse opens." Just as I hung up, a text message arrived from Lucas. "Mum, please don't come tomorrow. You'll ruin the day. Just stay at the motel. It's better for everyone." I looked at the message. I looked at the pile of evidence that proved I owned the very ground he was standing on. I typed back a single line. "Don't worry. I won't step inside. That doesn't mean I won't be there." At 8 o'clock in the morning on the day of my son's wedding, the air in Bayfield was humid and thick with the promise of celebration. While Sabrina was likely sitting in a silk robe having her makeup applied, and Lucas was perhaps shaking hands with early arrivals. I was walking up the limestone steps of the Bayfield County Courthouse. My heels clicked against the marble floor with a military rhythm. I was not there as a mother. I was there as the lead plaintiff in Price versus Price Innovations and Lowell Holdings. Mrs. Higgins met me at the filing clerk's window. She looked impeccable, holding a leather binder that contained the dismantling of my son's empire. We did not exchange pleasantries. We simply handed over the emergency motion for a temporary restraining order on all assets. "The judge is going to want to see the smoking gun immediately," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice low and sharp. "He won't freeze a multi-million-dollar merger on a wedding day for a hunch." "Show him." "Exhibit C," I replied, my voice steady. "The original Articles of Incorporation, Article 4, Section 2. That was the clause Lucas and his high-priced lawyers had ignored. It stated clearly that any restructuring of ownership required the unanimous written consent of all founding shareholders. They had assumed that by diluting my shares, they had diluted my rights. They were wrong. I had never signed away my veto power. By 10 o'clock, the judge had reviewed the evidence. He saw the forensic report on the forged signatures. He saw the internal emails from the Lowells discussing how to bypass the Ohio problem. The gavel came down. The temporary freeze was granted. The electronic notifications went out instantly. It was a digital blitzkrieg. Every bank holding a Price Innovations account, every investor involved in the Lowell Price development deal, and the legal teams for both families received a court-ordered cease and desist on financial transfers. I did not stop there. I opened my laptop in the courthouse lobby and logged into my personal email. I drafted a message to the Internal Audit Department of Harborline Assurance. I knew the specific codes to use, the specific language that triggers an automatic compliance review. Since Harborline was the primary insurer for the Lowell's new construction project, an allegation of material misrepresentation of guarantor assets would freeze their policy immediately. Without insurance, the construction loans would default within 24 hours. Next, I sent an email to the public relations firm Lucas had hired. I attached a folder of documents proving that the self-made billionaire narrative was a fabrication built on his mother's second mortgage. "If you print one more press release claiming Lucas Price started this company with nothing but a dream," I typed, "I will release these financial statements to the Wall Street Journal." Mrs. Higgins sat beside me, drafting the settlement offer. It was brutal in its simplicity. To lift the freeze, Lucas would have to publicly acknowledge the debt he owed me, restore my original 40% equity stake, and remove the Lowell family from the board of directors. "You know they are going to panic," Mrs. Higgins said, looking up from her screen. "This destroys their liquidity. They won't be able to pay the caterers." "That is the point," I said. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the general manager of Silver Palms Estate. I had met him briefly the day before when he had me removed. Mr. Henderson, I said when he answered, keeping my tone polite but dangerously formal. This is Eleanor Price. I am calling to inform you that a court order has just been issued freezing the accounts of the groom and the bride's family. If you accept any payment from those accounts today, you will be in contempt of court and liable for clawback litigation. There was a long silence on the other end. Mrs. Price, surely you aren't serious. He stammered. The ceremony starts in 2 hours. I suggest you ask for cash. Mr. Henderson? I said, and hung up. I packed my laptop and walked out of the courthouse. I crossed the street to a small coffee shop with a patio that offered a direct view of the resort's main gate. I ordered a black coffee. I sat down and opened my phone. I watched the read receipts turning blue one by one. The bank, the PR firm, the resort manager, and finally, Lucas. The machinery of the law is slow, but when you know which levers to pull, it can crush a man faster than he can say I do. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the caffeine hit my system. The wedding march was about to begin, but the music they were hearing inside the gates was the sound of their world grinding to a halt. Inside the gilded gates of Silver Palms Estate, the first domino fell exactly 4 minutes after the judge signed the order. I sat across the street, watching through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the reception hall. But I knew the script by heart. The wedding planner, a woman who had been dismissing my calls for weeks, suddenly pressed her earpiece tight against her head. Her face went pale. The finance department of the resort had just attempted to run the final authorization for $50,000 from the Lowell Price corporate account, only to be met with a hard decline code indicating a legal freeze. Victoria Lowell was the next to crack. I saw her storm over to the planner, waving her hand dismissively. She pulled out her phone, dialing her family attorney with the confidence of a woman who has never been told no. But the conversation did not go as she expected. "What do you mean?" Frozen Victoria hissed, her voice likely carrying over the string quartet tuning their instruments. "It's a glitch. Call the bank manager. Tell him I'll have his job if this isn't fixed in 5 minutes." She listened for a moment, and then her hand dropped to her side. The attorney had just informed her that the freeze was not a bank error. It was a court order requested by the primary founding shareholder, Eleanor Price. The woman she had called a quaint liability was now the reason her credit card was a useless piece of plastic. Sabrina, ever the performer, tried to hold the line. She grabbed Lucas's arm and forced a smile for the roaming photographer, posing near the ice sculpture. But behind her, the cracks were widening. 2 waiters were arguing with the catering manager near the service entrance, their gestures angry and sharp. They knew that if the main account was frozen, their tips were gone. The service slowed. The champagne stopped flowing. The illusion of effortless wealth was evaporating in the Florida heat. Then came the final blow. A man in a cheap, ill-fitting grey suit walked past security. He was not a guest. He was a process server. He marched straight through the floral archway and tapped Lucas on the shoulder. Lucas turned, annoyed at the interruption. The man handed him a thick envelope and said something short and official. Lucas looked down at the papers. He had to sign for them right there, in front of his college friends and potential investors. I watched him read the cover sheet. He froze. His face turned the color of ash. He was reading the words, Plaintiff Eleanor Price. He was realizing that the mother he had banned from the premises had just walked through the front door in the form of a subpoena. The whisper network of the rich is faster than fiber optics. I saw investors checking their phones, making frantic calls to their brokers to suspend pending transfers to price innovations. Sabrina stood frozen, watching her social capital drain away as guests began to whisper behind their hands. Mr. Henderson, the resort manager, finally lost his patience. He pulled Lucas and Victoria into a semi-private alcove near the window. I could see his body language. It was not the posture of a servant anymore. It was the posture of a creditor. We need a secondary form of payment. Henderson was undoubtedly saying, or a personal asset guarantee. Right now. Victoria lifted her chin, pointing vaguely toward the ocean, likely offering her beach villa as collateral. It was a bold move. It was also a lie. I saw their lawyer step in, pulling Victoria back by the elbow, whispering frantically into her ear. You can't. The villa is already leveraged, he would be telling her. And with the freeze order on the holding company, the bank has locked the personal equity too. We have nothing liquid. That was the twist they had hidden from everyone, perhaps even from Lucas. The Lowells were not wealthy. They were merely financed. And I had just cut the cord. In the midst of the chaos. Sabrina turned away from the arguing group. She looked out the window, past the panicked guests, and her eyes locked onto the small coffee shop across the street. She saw me. I was sitting at a patio table, calmly sipping my black coffee, looking directly at her. For the first time since I had met her, the look on her face was not disdain or pity. It was fear. She realized that the woman she had treated as a piece of furniture had just burned her house down. Lucas? She whispered, clutching his sleeve, her knuckles white. She's watching us. Lucas pushed open the glass door of the coffee shop, the cheerful jingle of the entry bell sounding like a mockery of his frantic expression. He was breathless. His tuxedo bow tie was crooked, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air conditioning. He marched to my table and collapsed into the chair opposite me, his hands gripping the edge of the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. Mom, what have you done? He asked, his voice cracking, hovering somewhere between rage and terror. The accounts, the cards, everything is declining. You froze everything. I set my coffee cup down on the saucer with a deliberate click. I didn't freeze everything. Lucas, I said, my voice calm, contrasting sharply with his panic. I simply froze the assets that rely on my credit to exist, which, as it turns out, is almost everything you claim to own. You don't understand. This is business, Lucas hissed, leaning in, his eyes darting around to see if anyone was listening. These deal structures are complex. It's not like balancing a checkbook at the kitchen table. We were going to remove your name as soon as the merger finalized. It was just a bridge loan. A bridge loan, using a forged signature, I asked. Do you really think a woman who spent 30 years reading insurance claims wouldn't notice when her signature on a $3 million liability contract was a digital copy lifted from a car lease? You made me the guarantor. Lucas. If your little real estate project with the Lowells failed, they would lose a shell company. I would lose my home. I was doing it for us, he argued, raising his voice, repeating the script I knew Sabrina had fed him. I'm trying to build a legacy here. I'm trying to step up to the next level. You're ruining my future because you can't handle being in the background for one day. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. I slid it across the table. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "Open it," I commanded. He hesitated, then ripped it open. Inside were the copies of the original wire transfers from 10 years ago, the sale of my wedding ring, the second mortgage, the initial capitalization of price innovations. "You forgot who paid for the first server." "Lucas," I said softly. "You forgot who ate toast for dinner so you could have a startup fund. You didn't build this alone. You stood on my shoulders, and now you are trying to saw my legs off." Before he could answer, the door chimed again. Victoria and Sabrina stormed in, bringing a cloud of expensive perfume and tension with them. They squeezed into the booth next to Lucas, creating a wall of hostility. Victoria adjusted her silk shawl, her face a mask of forced diplomacy. "Eleanor, surely we can resolve this like civilized people," Victoria said, flashing a tight, predatory smile. "This misunderstanding is causing a scene. If it's about money, we can write you a check right now. A settlement fee for your trouble. Then you lift the freeze, and we go back to the wedding." "A settlement fee," I repeated, looking at Sabrina, who refused to meet my eyes. "Is that what you call it? Is that the price for moving me to table 19 by the toilets? Is that the price for erasing me from the guest list?" "It was just a logistical error," Sabrina blurted out, her voice shrill. "No, it wasn't," I said, looking directly at Victoria. "I heard you, Victoria. I heard you in the VIP lounge. After we merge, we won't need the old lady in Ohio anymore." That was the plan, wasn't it? Use my credit to secure the loans, use my equity to inflate the valuation, and then cut me out before the ink was dry. Victoria's face turned a mottled shade of red. The mask dropped. She slammed her hand on the table. "You should be grateful," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "My daughter is elevating your son. We are giving him a name, a status he could never dream of. And you are a liability. You are just labor. You should thank us for letting you even stand in the parking lot." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucas looked at Victoria, his mouth slightly open, as if seeing her for the first time. Then he looked at me. "Mom," he whispered, his eyes pleading. "Please, just stop this. For me. For 35 years. That phrase had been my command. For me. I had worked double shifts for him. I had starved for him. I had bled for him. But as I looked at the woman who had just called me labor and the son who was too cowardly to defend me, something in me finally hardened into steel. "No," I said. "No." Lucas blinked, stunned. "You told me I would ruin your big day," I said, leaning forward. "But I haven't even started yet. This is just the opening argument. If you want this wedding to happen, if you want your company to survive the next hour, you will fix this. Right now." I pulled a fresh document from my bag, the settlement agreement Mrs. Higgins had drafted. I placed a pen on top of it. "Sign this," I ordered. "It restores my 40% equity. It removes the Lowells from the board, and it acknowledges your debt to me publicly. You choose. Lucas, you can be a Lowell puppet with a bankrupt company, or you can be my son with a future. But you cannot be both." I watched through the glass as Lucas stormed back into the staging room. I could not hear the words, but the body language of a collapsing empire is universal. The guests were already murmuring, casting side eyes at the empty champagne flutes and the frantic staff. inside the room. Sabrina grabbed Lucas by the lapels of his tuxedo. Her face was contorted, ugly with desperation. I learned later that she had given him an ultimatum, screaming through her tears that he had to choose between his future wife and the woman who was anchoring him to a poverty-stricken past. But reality has a way of interrupting even the most dramatic ultimatums. Mr. Henderson, the resort manager, stepped into the room. He did not care about family dynamics. He cared about his bottom line. He looked at his watch and gave them exactly 30 minutes. If a verified payment or a solid asset guarantee was not produced by then, the kitchen would shut down, the bar would close, and the live stream equipment would be packed up. The wedding of the century was half an hour away from becoming a silent room with no food. It was in that moment that Lucas finally saw the truth. He looked at Victoria Lowell, expecting her to pull out a checkbook, to save the day with the vast wealth she constantly boasted about. Instead, she looked away, fidgeting with her clutch. She needed price innovations to stay afloat just as much as he needed their connections. The realization hit him hard. He was not marrying into a higher class. He was being acquired to plug a leak in their sinking ship. Lucas pulled his phone out. He put it on speaker, right there in the middle of the room filled with white orchids. He called Mrs. Higgins. Read the terms again. He said, his voice flat. Mrs. Higgins, sitting next to me at the cafe, spoke clearly into the microphone. To lift the freeze, he had to sign the agreement returning my 40% equity, acknowledging his debt to me, and removing all Lowell family members from the board. It was a complete surrender. Sabrina lost her composure entirely. If you sign that, you are nothing. She screamed, loud enough that heads turned in the hallway. If you can't handle one old woman in Ohio, you aren't worthy of being my husband. You're just a mama's boy. That was the final cut. It was not love. It was a transaction, and he was failing to deliver the goods. Lucas didn't scream back. He simply took a pen from the table, bent over the document Mrs. Higgins had emailed him, and signed his name. Mrs. Higgins saw the signature hit her inbox instantly. She tapped her keyboard. The freeze on Lucas's personal account was lifted to pay the resort, but the corporate lockout of the Lowells was made permanent. Victoria Lowell's phone buzzed with the notification. She understood immediately that the meal ticket was gone. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and announced to the confused room that the wedding was postponed due to Sabrina's sudden health issues. She grabbed her daughter's arm and dragged her out the back exit, leaving the guests staring at an empty altar. 10 minutes later, Lucas walked out the front gate. He crossed the street and stood by my table. He looked exhausted, stripped of his arrogance. He placed the hard copy of the signed agreement on the table between us. I chose, he said quietly. A little late. I looked at him. I did not hug him. I did not tell him it would be okay. I simply nodded and put the paper in my bag. This isn't a victory. Lucas, I said, this is just the first time you learned that I am not someone you can erase just because it is convenient. I left Bayfield on an evening flight. As the plane climbed over the Florida coastline, leaving the glittering resorts behind, I looked out the window. There was no happy reunion, no tearful forgiveness. But as I watched the clouds drift by, I felt a peace I had not known in years. I adjusted my seatbelt and closed my eyes, telling myself that if anyone ever tried to use my love as a weapon against me again, I already knew exactly how to fire back. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on whether you think Lucas deserved to be forgiven. Don't forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button so more people can hear the truth about family and self-respect.